Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to talk about a budget commander deck that I've built around Raiyuu, Storm's Edge, a Boros Commander from Kimigawa, Neon Dynasty. This commander was actually suggested by a viewer sometime back, and while it might take me a while to get a deck and video made, nor can I guarantee that I can make a video based off of each suggestion, I do read all of the comments, so if there's a commander you'd like my take on, don't hesitate to throw it in the comments. As always, I've designed this deck to cost under $45 at the time of recording, based off of prices listed by Scryfall, including the cost of basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including the cost of shipping. And the link to the deck list will be in the description down below. Now let's get into this deck. So, Raiyuu, Storm's Edge is a 3/3 human samurai for 2 generic, a red and a white mana, with first strike and, whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, untap it, if it's the first combat phase this turn. There is an additional combat phase after this phase. So this commander really lends itself to a kind of Voltron deck, where you want to only attack with Raiyuu in your first combat phase, but you'll also likely want to have more creatures on your field to swing with during your second combat phase, which leads us to the goals of the 99 of this deck. To begin with, we can make use of effects like Exalted, which buff creatures that are attacking alone. Many of these effects happen to be on creatures, so they'll also help us fill our board with blockers and additional bodies to swing with in your second combat. We'll also be making use of some equipment and targeted buff spells to further buff Raiyuu, either helping him to get through on an opponent or to make him stronger. As we'll also be trying to hold an army outside of Raiyuu alone, we can make use of some Anthem effects to help buff those creatures. And finally, we'll be looking to add some cards that provide even more combat phases, since 2 per turn clearly isn't enough. So let's move on to the 99 by talking about our ramp spells. First up, we have Mind Stone, Marble Diamond, and Fire Diamond, all costing 2 generic and tapping for colorless, white, and red mana respectively. Then we have Ornithopter of Paradise, Felwar Stone, and Arcane Signet, which will generally tap for any color of mana that we need. And then there's Boros Signet, converting 1 mana of any color into a white and a red mana. Commander Sphere, which taps for any color in Raiyuu's color identity, along with a small amount of card draw. And finally, Navigation Orb, which lets you search your library for 2 basic and or gate lands, which you reveal, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, and then you shuffle. This can be really effective for mana fixing, as you can search for, say, a Gond Gate, and then one of either Boros Guild Gate, Cliff Gate, or Citadel Gate, and if you place Gond Gate onto the battlefield, then the other into your hand, then on your next turn, you'll be able to have 2 untapped dual lands, as Gond Gate will let your other gate enter the battlefield untapped. Now let's move on to the spells that'll buff creatures that are attacking alone. To begin, creatures such as a Krazen Squire, Goblin Champion, Aven Squire, and Knight of Glory have Exalted, which gives a creature you control that is attacking alone +1/+1 until the end of the turn, and this effect can stack if you have multiple instances of Exalted on the field. Similar to this are Eiganjo Exemplar and Asari Captain, the former basically giving Exalted, but only when a Samurai or Warrior attack alone, and the latter gives +1 power for each Samurai or Warrior you control when a Samurai or Warrior attacks alone. We also have Angelic Benediction, Battle Grace Angel, and Sublime Archangel, all with Exalted, but Angelic Benediction additionally lets you tap down a creature when attacking solo, Battle Grace Angel gives your solo attacker lifelink until the end of the turn, and Sublime Archangel gives your other creatures Exalted as well, which can stack even if a creature already has Exalted. We also have Angelic Exaltation, which gives a creature you control attacking alone +X/+X for the turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. Selfless Samurai, which gives a Samurai or Warrior you control that is attacking alone lifelink for the turn, and additionally, it can be sacrificed to give another creature you control indestructible until the end of the turn. Peerless Samurai has Menace, and when a Samurai or Warrior you control attacks alone, the next spell you cast this turn costs 1 less generic mana to cast. Then we have Tempered in Solitude, which lets you exile the top card of your library when a creature you control attacks alone, and you may play that card this turn. And finally, we have Bastion Protector, which, while not an attacking alone effect, it does give Raiyuu +2/+2 and indestructible. That all being said, we can also make use of equipment and targeted buff spells to power up Raiyuu, and maybe some of our other creatures. This includes Swiftfoot Boots, which gives us some protection with hexproof and additionally haste. There's also Haunted Cloak and Loxodon Warhammer, both giving trample, the former also giving vigilance and haste, and the latter giving +3 power and lifelink. Zephyr Boots grants some evasion with flying, and additionally, when his equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card, then discard a card. Fire Shrieker and Lizard Blades grant double strike, with Lizard Blades being a living weapon, where it enters the battlefield as a creature, but can also become an equipment. Basilisk Collar can make Raiyuu or another creature even less enticing to block, as it grants Death Touch, along with lifelink. Then Beamtown Beatstick and Sticky Fingers grant their creature Menace and, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. Beamtown Beatstick also gives its creature +1 power, and Sticky Fingers gives, when enchanted creature dies, draw a card. We then have Sigil of Valor, Blackblade Reforged, and Lion Sash. Sigil of Valor gives its equipped creature +1/+1 when it attacks alone for each other creature you control. Blackblade Reforged gives its equipped creature +1/+1 for each land you control. And Lion Sash is a living weapon that provides some graveyard hate, as you can pay 1 white mana to exile a card from a graveyard, and if that card were a permanent, Lion Sash gets a +1/+1 counter on it. And if Lion Sash is equipped to a creature, it gives that creature +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. And finally, we have an instant with Blazing Crescendo, giving target creature +3/+1 for the turn, along with some impulse draw card advantage. And Rogue's Gloves, letting you draw if its equipped creature deals combat damage to a player. Now, as we have a significant number of creatures in this deck, we may want to make use of some effects that apply to more than one of our creatures at a time. This includes Divine Sacrament, which gives white creatures +1/+1, or +2/+2 if you happen to have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. There's also Felidar Retreat with a landfall, either letting you make a 2/2 Cat Beast creature token, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. They also gain Vigilance until the end of the turn, of which you'll be predominantly wanting to choose the latter option in this deck. We also have Sarah's Blessing and Brave the Sands, which give our creatures Vigilance. Brave the Sands additionally lets our creatures block an additional creature. Archetype of Aggression gives our creatures Trample, and makes it so our opponents can't have Trample on their creatures. And finally, we have Godo, Bandit Warlord, and Aurelia, the War Leader. Godo lets you tutor for an equipment card that you put directly onto the battlefield when he enters the battlefield. And additionally, when he attacks for the first time each turn, you untap Godo and all samurai you control, and then you get an additional combat phase. And Aurelia has Flying, Vigilance, and Haste, and similar to Godo, when Aurelia attacks for the first time each turn, untap all creatures you control, and there's an additional combat phase. So, with one of these two on the field, you can first attack with Raiyuu alone, getting you a second combat phase, and then attack with, say, Raiyuu, Aurelia, and the rest of your creatures, and then Aurelia's attacked for the first time this turn, so her ability procs, you untap all your creatures, and you'd move on to a third combat phase. The main thing to keep in mind with all these additional combat phases, though, is that your creature's toughness isn't refreshed between the combat phases, so if they took damage in an earlier phase, they'll be easier for your opponents to kill in one of the later combat phases. So you'll want to be a little careful when deciding what to swing at whom. That being said, we're going to need ways of keeping cards available for us to cast, and while Boros colors aren't known for being the greatest at card advantage, there's now some cards that we can use to mitigate this weakness. And for this deck, I went mostly with Impulse Draw, which includes Reckless Impulse, Ren's Resolve, and Light Up the Stage, all of which have you exile the top 2 cards of your library, which you may play until the end of your next turn. Light Up the Stage can also be cast at a reduced cost if an opponent lost life during the turn that you were casting it. There's also Commune with Lava, an X-Spell version of Impulse Draw, having you exile X cards, which you can play until the end of your next turn. We also have Outpost Siege, which you'll almost always want to choose Cons, which has you exile the top card of your library during your upkeep, which you can play until the end of that turn. Valakut Exploration has a Landfall, having you exile the top card of your library when you play a land card, which you may play so long as it's exiled. However, if you don't cast it that turn, you put that card into the graveyard, and Valakut Exploration deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards put into your graveyard that way, which will almost always be at most 1 damage in this deck. And finally, we have Magus of the Wheel and Mind's Eye, the former being a wheel effect on a creature, and the latter letting you pay 1 generic whenever an opponent draws a card to let you also draw a card. That all being said, we're also going to want ways of interacting with what our opponents are doing beyond our attack phase, which we can start with Ethereal Haze and Holy Day. These are fog-like effects in white colors, having you prevent all combat damage that would be dealt that turn, which can be great to prevent yourself from taking lethal or near-lethal amounts of damage. We also have Loran's Escape and Loyal Unicorn for protection. The former being an instant that gives a target artifact or creature hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn, also allowing you to scry one, and the latter prevents combat damage from being dealt to your creatures on your combat phases and giving them vigilance for that turn, provided you control your commander at the start of your combat phase. However, we'll also want to deal with things on our opponent's boards, so we have cards like Lightning Bolt, letting you deal 3 damage to any target, By Force, an X spell letting you destroy X artifacts, Disenchant, letting you destroy a target artifact or enchantment, Swords to Plowshares, one of the best creature removal spells in the game, Generous Gift, letting you destroy any target permanent, but its controller gets a 3/3 green elephant in return. And finally, we have a couple of board wipes with Cleansing Nova and Austere Command, which can act as a panic button in case we get far behind or another player gets incredibly dangerous and hard to deal with. And now that we've gotten through all of our spells, let's go over our lands. First up are the 4 gates that I talked about earlier in the ramp section. Then we have some scry lands with Crystal Grotto, Temple of Triumph, and Zalfir Void. Then we have a few additional dual lands with Furycom Snarl, a reveal land, Windscarred Crag, a life gain land, and Boros Garrison, a bounce land. Up next are a few utility lands with Rogue's Passage, Slayer's Stronghold, and Cathedral of War. Rogue's Passage letting you make a creature unblockable for the turn, Slayer's Stronghold letting you give a target creature +2 power, vigilance, and haste for the turn, and Cathedral of War giving you an additional instance of Exalted. Then we have Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, reskins of each other that let you sack them to search your library for a basic land, which enters the battlefield tapped. Then there's Ash Barrens, which has basic land cycling for 1 generic mana, allowing for a little bit more color fixing with your basic lands. And finally, we'll fill out the rest of this deck with 10 plains and 10 mountains. So now that we've gotten through all the cards, let's look at that price. And as you can see, this deck is currently sitting right between $44 and $45 at the time of recording, including the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but not including shipping. Now I'd like to go through some cards that you may wish to consider subbing in to upgrade this deck, some of which are a bit more expensive, some of which are pretty budget friendly. First up is Stonehewer Giant, which has an equipment tutor that lets you attach the tutored equipment directly onto a creature. Then there's Duelist's Heritage, which gives a creature of your choice double strike when you're attacking. We also have Silent Arbiter, which makes it so no more than 1 creature can attack or block per turn, which works well enough for us as we were already planning on only attacking with 1 of our creatures for at least 1 of our combat phases, and thus this is likely to cause more problems for our opponents than ourselves. There's also Professional Facebreaker, giving you a treasure token whenever 1 or more of your creatures deals combat damage to a player, and you can also sack a treasure for a bit of card advantage. Then finally, we have Wheel of Fate as an additional wheel effect, and Path to Exile for additional creature removal. Regardless, if you'd like to build, upgrade, adapt, or play with this deck, the link as always is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander decks, consider dropping the channel a sub. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.